Let's get into the last section in the morning. This session we're going to discuss Trump's Asia-Pacific security policy and the promises. Welcome our moderator, the former president of Promotion Association for Public Affairs, Dr. Bob Yin Yang, and our honorable speakers, the former director of the Taipei office of the American Institute in Taiwan, Dr. William Stanton.
你说，各位乡亲大家好。我刷来咱的讲员是 William Stanton 大使，伊汉文名叫司徒文吼。Stanton 大使是一个足特殊的贵宾，伊是一个热爱台湾的美国人。咱先来讲伊。 这几年来的历历，2009年到2012年，William Stanton 在台湾做 AIT 的 Director， 就是美国驻台的实质大使。伊退任以后，得到台湾政府颁布的 居留证 （Resident Certificate）， 变做讲，伊是得到台湾的永久的居留权啦吼。因为伊要伫台湾住，伊热爱台湾。这个情形是足特殊的吼，外国的外交家来台湾，即款情形真少，超过2-3个尔吼。所以咱这个威廉 Stanton 大使是其中之一。2010年伊退任以后，伫迄个台北的美国大学有教淡薄仔册，刷落入去清华大学的亚洲研究中心做主任，啊，佮做担当副校长。啊，今年8月初 August 1st，right？ 伊转过咱国立 台湾大学的一个同届新的学院，叫做国际学院 （International College）。这个学院即摆还搁咧筹备吼，还未开始招生啊。不过这是一个新的概念，将来学生毋但是台湾的学生尔，嘛要向外国招生啦吼。啊，咧教册的时阵是要用英语咧教吼，所以这是一个新的概念。伊即摆伫即个 International College 台湾大学。 咧做教授吼，啊，刷落来我甲大家介绍伊一寡东亚的经验啦。伊有3年伫韩国，啊3年伫欧洲 （Australia）， 啊有6年的时间伫中国吼，所以伫欧洲伫迄个亚洲的经验是非常丰富。爱伫1978年开始。 拢总有34年的时间，伫美国的国务院咧食头路啦吼，所以这个外交部分应当是伊的经验是相当丰富。今日因为时间较迫的吼，所以我无需要搁详细的介绍。总是伊通介重要的经验，就是伫亚洲，伊通介一个国家，除了美国以外，就是咱台湾吼，爱伫台湾有永久居留权。 今仔日要甲咱分析美国川普总统的亚洲安全的策略。So that's the topic of Dr. Stanton's speech. Please. Okay.
大家好。可是我不会说台语，所以对不起。杨博士, President Deng, Honorable President Luo, distinguished guests, 各位贵宾, particularly from our visitors from Korea and Japan, thank you everyone for now sitting through my talk when I know what you really want to do is eat lunch. 我请你们都应该原谅我，是因为我觉得我的中文不够好，就说中文。可是我也知道大概现在你饿了，所以对不起。Okay, the Trump administration is supposed to this fall release a series of foreign policy position papers, including an overall national security strategy. Whether or not, we'll have to see. But whatever those papers say, I believe the contradictions and the incoherence that have marked President Trump's foreign policies thus far, unfortunately, are likely to continue. Key reasons for the difficulties we face in assessing the direction of Trump's policies toward Asia include Trump's narcissistic, inattentive, and mercurial temperament, his ignorance of the most fundamental facts of history, U.S. policy, and world politics, his apparent inability and unwillingness to study, listen, and learn, and his woefully limited vision of the world, reflecting inherited wealth in a life largely spent selling real estate, promoting his name as a brand, running beauty pageants, and hosting a TV game show. There are daily examples in Trump's foreign policy of these inadequacies. In March, Trump told a bemused German Chancellor Merkel that German trade negotiators had done a much better job than their U.S. counterparts on trade, a claim belied by the fact that the United States and Germany never negotiated a trade agreement. So what was he talking about? He also falsely claimed that Germany owed the United States vast sums of money, I guess in his imagination. In an interview with the Wall Street Journal in April, Trump claimed that Korea actually used to be part of China, a claim that is not true, of course, even though, as Trump said, Xi Jinping told him it was so. In May, Trump publicly declared that he would be honored to meet the North Korean dictator, Kim Jong-un. Should have separated these pages earlier. And offered a visit to the White House to Philippine President Duterte, who is accused of leading an anti-drug campaign that has murdered thousands of alleged drug dealers. This oblivious disregard for fact, or at least inattention to details, appears to have infected the White House at large. In a July statement, the White House called Xi Jinping the President of the Republic of China, news to you, instead of the People's Republic of China. The White House also incorrectly described Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister, as the President of Japan, and called the Canadian Prime Minister of Canada Joe, rather than by his actual name, Justin. Trump's invitations to Kim and Duterte were symptomatic of another one of the most troubling aspects of Trump's foreign policy orientation, his frequent criticism of our allies, friends, and neighbors, including, I should mention, Korea and Japan. And in contrast, his apparent fondness for our authoritarian leaders, especially Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, who lead countries and formulate policies that threaten U.S. interests and are inimical to U.S. values. There's also the problem of continuing lies and distortions of facts. As of August 25, the Washington Post found that in the first 218 days since taking office, Trump had made 1,094 false or misleading statements, an average of 5 false claims a day. The New York Times similarly published on July 21 an updated list of 116 major lies Trump had told since taking office. Key falsehoods about foreign policy included his claim that the fake media had incorrectly stated he had changed his stance on China. He claimed he had not changed his stance when, of course, in fact, he had. Instead of criticizing China, he began to praise China. He also claimed that currency manipulation that he'd long accused China of doing had stopped once he became president. In fact, as many economists had all along pointed out, the inflation, the lowering of the value of the yuan had been occurring since at least 2014. He also claimed that under the Climate Trade Pact, the climate agreement, that China and India would be allowed to build additional coal plants, but the US could not. In fact, the trade agreement doesn't say anything on this issue. He also doesn't understand the fact that the US is becoming energy independent through the discovery of fracking and will increasingly be dependent on natural gas, much less oil, much less coal. He also said that the trade agreement with Mexico was close to $70 billion, and with Canada it was a $17 billion deficit, when in fact it was an $8.1 billion deficit surplus with Canada, and the deficit was a good $6 billion less with Mexico. He also claimed that, you know, we've gotten billions of dollars more now in NATO, all because of me. In other words, that he had changed NATO's contributions. The other members of NATO, their contributions, when in fact the United States had negotiated a new deal with NATO back in 2014 as well. So this is a problem. Another problem is, of course, that in determining future US policies, decisions, continuing absence of a large number of personnel in key positions. There's a chart in the book where this was printed showing this, and it's nowhere worse than in the State Department, where there is still no Assistant Secretary for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. There's still no ambassador to South Korea. And this at a time when we're facing the greatest crisis ever over North Korea, as our two excellent speakers from Seoul have pointed out. In addition, Secretary Tillerson at the State Department continues his plans to make drastic cuts in State Department personnel and a proposed 31% reduction in funding, both for personnel but largely for US aid programs, which are some of our best programs that we've ever done. Historically, if you look back at what are the US foreign policy successes, you would have to say the Marshall Program after World War II. You'd have to say the Fulbright Program to bring scholars from all over the world to the United States. These are the kinds of programs that would be affected by this. He's also invited an outside business consultancy which knows nothing about the State Department to entirely reorganize the State Department. As reported by Foreign Policy magazine on July 31, a hostile White House is slashing the State Department's budget. The rank and file are cut off from a detached leader who also seems to be rather distant from the president. And morale has plunged to an all-time low in the State Department, which, as a former Foreign Service officer, troubles me no end. Just as important, however, are the continuing divisions and infighting among Trump's advisors over policy matters, both domestic and foreign. China, however, is a key example. It is evident that American investment bankers like Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, National Economic Council Director Gary Cohn, and Deputy National Security Advisor Dina Powell have favored maintaining traditional US relations with China, in which the overall relationship, going back to Kissinger, outweighs any individual conflicts of interest, of which there are so many. Mnuchin, Cohn, and Powell all previously worked for investment banker Goldman Sachs, one of whose principal sources of profit was always China. Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, whose family real estate business has continued to pursue sales to PRC customers, belongs in this group as well. He's made good friends with the Chinese ambassador in Washington, as does his wife and Trump's daughter, Ivanka, many of whose brand name products are made in China, and in some of whose manufacturing companies, there are allegedly huge labor problems, human rights issues. This is a really difficult situation. In contrast, there are some advisors like Peter Navarro, an economic advisor, and now departed Steve Bannon, who at least on the issue of China had taken a much harder line. Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross, who has a mixed record on China because he's an investment banker who apparently still has $1 billion investment in a joint venture with China in a shipping company, but has apparently also been advocating a tougher trade line, perhaps representing the Department of Commerce on trade with China. We have to get tougher. In addition, senior national security advisor Matt Pottinger, who spent several years in China as a journalist before serving as a captain in the Marines in Afghanistan, based on his experience and his public comments about his experience in China, has a much more realistic view of what China is like, as all of those who spent any time over the years in Beijing do. He has often remarked, I once, in a meeting with people who are very pro-China at Tsinghua University, I pointed out to them that having spent 6 years in China, I had a far better and more realistic understanding of China and had spent far more time than all of them put together actually living in China. So too often the people who make policy on China really don't understand it at all. In addition, and most important, the Secretary of Defense Mattis has staked out strong positions on Taiwan as well as China. At the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore in June, he reportedly outraged Beijing with an explicit public commitment to help Taiwan defend itself, even while noting that the U.S. was committed to a so-called one China policy. He said, "The Department of Defense remains steadfastly committed to working with Taiwan and its democratic government to provide it the defense articles necessary, consistent with obligations set out in the Taiwan Relations Act. Because we stand for peaceful resolution of any issue in a manner acceptable to people on both sides of the Taiwan Strait." PLA representatives at Shangri-La predictably objected to Mattis's statement, voiced objections to any U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, and to its failure to cite the 3 joint communiques. Also arousing their ire were Mattis's strong comments on the South China Sea. He said the scope and effect of China's construction activities in the South China Sea differ from those of other countries in several ways. The nature of its militarization, its disregard for international law, its contempt for other nations' interests, and its efforts to dismiss non-adversarially resolution of issues. He said, "We oppose countries militarizing artificial islands and enforcing excessive maritime claims unsupported by international law." Well, you can read the rest of it, but he rejected coercive unilateral changes to the status quo and made a commitment to continuing our operations, military operations in the South China Sea and elsewhere. In general, it's the U.S. military agencies and the intelligence communities that are most concerned about the threats China poses to U.S. interests, and that has always been the case. They, after all, will have to fight any conflicts that may result from our differences with China. And they are most wary of the upbeat assessments about the future of U.S.-China relations. In a July 28th interview with Bill Kurtz of the conservative Washington Free Beacon, for example, CIA Director Pompeo pointed to China as the greatest long-term threat to the United States, an assessment with which I would agree. He said, I think China has the capacity to present the greatest rivalry to America of any country over the medium to long term. The rapid buildup of the Chinese military is very focused on countering US power projection. And whether you're talking about when you see what's going on in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, their work doing what they're doing in other parts of the world. And he continued to be more concerned. If you look at them, he said they are probably trying either to steal our stuff or make sure they can defeat it. He means both our military secrets and counteractions. He called attention to troubles with commercial relations as well, probably noting, likely referring to the intellectual property theft of which China is the leader in the world. He said they see themselves as a rival superpower and so intend to conduct their version of espionage programs in a way that reflects their superpower status. I would note today in the press, another Chinese espionage agent has been identified right here in Taiwan. In recent months, there's another one who was identified in the United States. Gortz had another interview in this vein, this time with Guo Wengui, the Chinese dissident who's very controversial, says a lot of things. We don't know for sure whether they're true or not, but he clearly had very close contacts with Chinese intelligence agencies. In an interview, he asserted that over the past 50 years, Beijing had developed spy networks in the United States that included up to 25,000 Chinese intelligence officers and more than 15,000 recruited American agents. While these figures could be exaggerated, there's no one who doubts the overall espionage threat in the United States. Despite these strong concerns of US military and intelligence agencies, that are widely shared by the US Congress as well, President Trump has generally pursued a more favorable but also erratic approach to China. Following his frequent strong criticism of China when he was a candidate and his cordial December 2 phone call and conversation with Taiwan President Tsai Ing-wen, he quickly reverted to more traditional US policy lines towards both the PRC and Taiwan. And I can't help but wonder if part of this was not only his advisors from Goldman Sachs, but also, of course, we have to remember Goldman Sachs began, actually Kissinger Associates began in part with a $5 million loan from Goldman Sachs. And Kissinger, over the years after he was Secretary of State, used Kissinger Associates as a means to gain access for US companies in Beijing. And Kissinger, we know, as soon as the phone call had taken place, ran off to Beijing to try to smooth ruffled feathers there. And he came back and he had meetings, of course, with Jared Kushner and with Trump. And I guess his malevolent influence, as I regard it over the years, towards US-China relations continues. In any case, after he had the positive phone call, Trump tweeted and reverted to seemingly a threat that perhaps Taiwan might be only a bargaining chip when he said, you know, unless we make a deal with China, I don't know whether we need to abide by a one China policy, which can be taken in two different directions, as whether as a threat to both Taiwan or to China. In the course of his confirmation hearing, however, Secretary Tillerson specifically reassured America that Taiwan is friends of the United States, be treated as a bargaining chip. And he said the US commitment to Taiwan was both a legal commitment and a moral imperative. Probably the strongest language I've heard in some time about Taiwan. I guess going back to when Hillary Clinton said it was an important strategic and economic partner, or security and economic partner. So it was reminiscent of that. Significantly also, he didn't mention the 3 communiques, but he did mention, he reaffirmed, or if he said the 3 communiques, he also specifically reaffirmed the 6 assurances, one of which there will be no change in the US position on Taiwan's sovereignty. Nevertheless, we then had the April 6-7 meeting with Xi Jinping in Mar-a-Lago. And Trump erroneously seemed to think he and Xi had reached a meeting of minds. Somehow Xi would bring North Korea to heel and that China would take steps to reduce its huge trade surplus with the United States. Despite getting nothing concrete from Xi, Trump was effusive in praising his imagined friendship with the PRC's ruler. Quote, "We had great chemistry together. We like each other. I like him a lot. I think his wife is terrific." While admitting that so far I've gotten nothing, absolutely nothing, he said, "But we have developed a friendship." I can see that. And I think the long term, we're going to have a very, very great relationship, and I look very much forward to it. For anyone who's ever dealt with the Chinese, this is just beyond belief to talk in this manner. Despite the absence of any progress on North Korea, President Trump continued to praise Xi Jinping. Only hours after still jailed Chinese dissident Nobel Prize laureate Liu Xiaobo died on July 13th, Trump, in a joint press conference with French President Macron, calls Xi a friend and a great leader he respects. Quote, "He is a very talented man. I think he's a very good man. He loves China, I can tell you. He loves China. He wants to do what's right for China." Well, what about doing right for what's good for the US? Foregoing an earlier condemnation of China's trade policies, he reached a so-called agreement with Xi at Mar-a-Lago for a 100-day effort to resolve bilateral trade differences before the inaugural meeting of the US-China Comprehensive Economic Dialogue. When the meeting convened, however, on July 19th, the Chinese quickly deflated Trump's hopes. China refused to give the United States any numerical benchmarks for reducing the trade surplus, the steel overcapacity, rejected tariff reductions on US autos, greater access to financial markets, and refused to loosen China's data localization requirements. Premier Wang is typically criticized what he called outdated US regulations on export controls and repeated the oft-heard argument that the US isn't exporting to us the advanced technologies we need. Was basically is tantamount to an invitation to give us more technology that we can steal and then reproduce. When China has the worst record in the world on intellectual property rights with the United States. Some estimates as high as 85% of all US IPR theft is by China. So, in fact, on August 12th, again, another turnaround, the US Trump administration announced it would launch an investigation of Chinese IPR violations. I don't know why it needed an investigation. There have been many. They're on the public record, both by Congress and by congressional reports. So overall, this experience of his encounter with the Chinese and this particular negotiation on trade is what we in China and businessmen in China in the late 1980s called friendship business. And by that, the Chinese seem to me to always mean you give the Chinese business and technology and money, and they give you their friendship. So it's not an even deal. After North Korea fired an intercontinental ballistic missile on July 28th that landed in Japan's maritime exclusive economic zone, President Trump finally seemed to realize that his flattery of Xi and words of friendship had accomplished nothing. In a tweet on July 30, he fumed, "I am very disappointed in China. Our foolish past leaders, as opposed to me, have allowed them to make hundreds of billions of dollars in trade, yet they do nothing for us in North Korea, just talk. We will no longer allow this to continue. China could easily solve this problem." Well, okay, China's also been unhappy with the US. Washington announced on June 29th the arms deal worth $1.42 billion US. The same day announced a series of sanctions against Chinese individuals and entities doing business with North Korea. I think there should be much tougher sanctions, unilateral sanctions by the US on North Korea if we're going to stop what North Korea is doing short of a military conflict. That's my own view. But anyway, that was a step in the right direction. The Trump administration also approved increased freedom of navigation actions, transits in the South China Sea and elsewhere. And we had, as of August 10th, we had 3 freedom of navigation exercises within China's claimed territorial waters in the South China Sea, including the Mischief Reef. We've also had, on the positive side, continuing congressional support for Taiwan, as in years past. But unfortunately, a lot of this legislation may never be passed, or it may not get approved or supported in the White House. On May 4th, 6 US senators introduced the Taiwan Travel Act, a reiteration of earlier congressional bills calling for more visits between officials of Taiwan and the United States at all levels, including higher levels. And instead of restrictions on those visits, on June 28th, the Senate Armed Services Committee approved a bill calling for resumption of port visits for Taiwan, and apparently we are going forward with some mutual participation in naval exercises, or that's what I'm reading now in the media. This call for the resumption of port visits, that would be, if it happened, the first time since 1979. It also directs the Pentagon to help Taiwan develop indigenous undersea warfare programs and recommends strengthened strategic cooperation. There was another bill introduced which would require senior military and diplomatic exchanges and an annual strategic dialogue at higher levels, port visits, and Taiwan port visits to the United States. There was another bill asking that the US government do more to help Taiwan become a full member of the World Health Organization, which probably won't happen because China seems to have a lock on the bureaucracies in international organizations where they've put many people or many of their client states dependent on Chinese investment in aid in key positions who always vote. Let's remember that when Kim Jong-il died, the General Assembly of the UN held a moment of silence in honor of that great dictator. So you can't expect much from international organizations. I would say overall, though, given these ups and downs, on balance, all of Trump's comments, both negative, positive, and negative rhetoric about China, US policies towards PRC and Taiwan have not radically changed as of now. But I would say that overall US attitudes toward China continue to get tougher in the face of continuing differences over North Korea, the South China Sea, Taiwan, and trade. Meanwhile, US attitudes towards Taiwan, certainly in Congress, remain positive, especially in the Congress. Despite Trump's strong criticism of NATO and earlier our alliances with Japan and Tokyo, President Trump has found it necessary to strengthen U.S. ties with both countries. And despite Trump's seeming infatuation with both Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping and his attempts to improve relations with both countries, overall relations with these key adversaries, in my view, are continuing to grow worse. A similar stiffening of the U.S. stance towards China was evident over the course of President Obama's 2 terms. If you remember, between his first visit to China in November of 2010 and his pivot to Asia, first announced by Secretary Clinton in October of 2011, there clearly was a recognition of the the strategic need to rebalance toward Asia, the importance of Asia, as well as the negotiation of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement, which we signed on February 4th, 2016. So for all the sound and fury of Trump, his campaign promises and his twits, perhaps the most consequential Trump policies have been 2. Most important, withdrawal of the U.S. participation from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, an ill-considered move which has reduced both the strategic and economic leverage of the United States in Asia, and also something that reduces the confidence of Asian countries who are already economically dependent on China, that the U.S. will be there strategically with them. And with the climate change agreement, it's still too soon because there are so many states and NGOs and so many of the clauses in the climate change agreement depend on individual actions. It's possible that maybe the spirit and a good bit of the substance of the climate change agreement will still go into effect. We'll have to see. A more subtle shift, but even more worrisome, or just as worrisome for me as the departure from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, is Trump's departure from President Obama's focus on the importance of Asia to America's future, and his concomitant desire to withdraw forces from Iraq, Afghanistan, and not to get involved in Syria. In fact, now he's put more troops again into the Middle East and Afghanistan. And according to media reports, was not convinced, even though according to media, he was not convinced more troops, after 16 years of war, more troops in Afghanistan would do anything. This appears to reflect, in my view, the objectively unjustified preoccupation with terrorism on the part of both Trump and his many senior military advisors, all of whom served in the U.S. military in the Middle East and Afghanistan. And often where you have sat and what you have done determines your view of the world. I served both in the Middle East, and then I decided that there was no future and no hope in the Middle East, and I went to Asia. So I have a different view. I think it's pointless, the U.S. involvement in what are essentially tribal and religious conflicts that the United States will not be able to solve or help solve. Besides, given the growing energy independence of the United States, we're increasingly getting more energy from natural gas through fracking and are going to become a net exporter of energy. In fact, one of the supposed agreements with China was to export natural gas to them. And if you look at the chart I've shown, we're not going to be dependent on Middle East oil at all anymore. It's not a strategic interest of the U.S. to be involved in the Middle East. And if your argument is we have to make the world safe for terrorism, I put a chart that you'll see in the magazine that shows that between 2001 and the attack on 9/11, this was a CNN survey, and 2014, some 3,400 Americans died just around the world from terrorism, and almost 3,000 of those died in the 9/11 attacks. In other words, Since then, about 400 people plus, a little bit over 400 people died from terrorism worldwide. In that same period of time, 440,000 people died in the United States alone from domestic gun violence. I'm sure if you did surveys of traffic deaths, deaths from smoking, deaths from alcoholism, you'd find that they're greater threats to the United States as well. So terrorism always needs, as much as it gets headlines, to be put in rational perspective. Absent the North Korean bone in America's throat, it's not clear that Trump would have paid nearly as much attention to Asia, or that US relations with Japan and Korea would not have worsened over trade deficits and perceived imbalance in military burden sharing based on misunderstandings on Trump's part, who appears never to have received a briefing on actually how much Korea, NATO, and Japan contribute to defense sharing. Trump's decision to try to get China to solve the North Korean nuclear problem also demonstrated a woeful ignorance of the intense US diplomatic efforts, extending back at least to President Clinton. I know because I worked during that administration, and I wrote many of the papers on the six-party talks and the press guidance in which we are always praising China for its role in solving peacefully the North Korean problem, none of which worked. So, in the same way, his ignorance of the advantages of the TPP showed he didn't understand its trade advantages, and the need to embrace more closely our Asian friends. As of this writing, however, or as this point in time, it's difficult for me to perceive a coherent Trump policy toward Asia. Aside from slogans like America First, we have only his tweeted comments, often expressing displeasure about one issue or another. What we lack is a positive agenda and clear directions. Nonetheless, I'd offer a few personal thoughts about the future we face in Asia, whatever Trump may do. First of all, I think that the North Korean nuclear problem is going to continue. The sixth North Korean nuclear test on September 3 with a hydrogen bomb was another blatant signal that this problem is going to continue to fester. Nonetheless, it serves no one's interests for a conflict, a military conflict, to erupt. When I worked for Undersecretary for Political Affairs and we flew to Seoul sometime during the Clinton administration, and the Clinton administration was talking about a kinetic, that is a military response to North Korean nuclear problem. The commander-in-chief at the time of the US forces in Korea flew with us in a helicopter over the River Han and described to us what would happen in the streets of Seoul below and the tens of thousands of people who would be killed in the first hours of a military conflict. And when we went back, the Undersecretary drafted a memo which I think played a key role in the fact that they began to look for other solutions. It's not that we can't win such a war, but the cost is just too high. So unless they have a preventive solution that works or a cryptographic attack that works, I think we're probably going to face more of the same. But I also think that as a result, one thing is going to happen is Japan and Korea are going to be more willing to develop more sophisticated weapon systems. The South Korean government has already announced that it would like to further strengthen its own ballistic missile defenses and would like to expand both the payload and apparently it indicated, I take it as an indication, they want to extend the payload and the reach of its own missiles. And of course, it allowed the THAAD missile program to go forward, and there may be even more of that. Also, we know the South Korean public is far more willing than the Japanese public to consider developing their own nuclear weapons based on polling in South Korea. I think it's a much bigger reach for the Japanese public continuing their own suffering from US nuclear attacks. Still, Japan is the only country the United States has allowed to acquire the technology it would need to develop nuclear weapons, and it reprocesses nuclear fuel. And if it were to happen, if Japan were ever to make that decision, the fulfillment of China's worst nightmare, because at one point they used to say they were happy the US remained in Asia because it prevented the Japanese from developing nuclear weapons. As a Japanese official once said to me when I said, well, I guess you could have a nuclear weapon in a month or two, huh? And he said, well, it may take that long, but I doubt it. So it could come much more quickly. So the whole situation could be up in the air. It is likely, as I already indicated, that the US-China relationship is going to continue to fray. The PRC's continuing reluctance to put pressure on North Korea to halt its programs has prompted calls from many in Washington to impose tougher sanctions against Chinese companies. We'll have to see how the current sanctions work and whether there will be more. It was no surprise Treasury Department already imposed some sanctions. As usual, China objected to these, but as already been indicated, China wants to have it both ways. It really doesn't worry anymore. Once I had a meeting with the Chinese about after India exploded a nuclear weapon. And they said, well, we're not really worried about it. India wouldn't use it against us. I think that is actually, has been said, the attitude of the Chinese towards North Korea. The importance of North Korea as a buffer state, the geostrategic importance is all important to China. Meanwhile, China's aggressive maritime measures in the oceans or seas around them, its huge trade surplus with the US, its IPR violations, unwillingness to trade on an equitable basis have also reinforced the growing sentiment in the US that the overall bilateral relationship is out of whack and does not any longer serve US interests. I think the Kissingerian consensus is beginning to erode and it's changing. China's own domestic policies limit Xi Jinping's flexibility, and especially what we see in the 19th Party Congress was probably going to be no change with regard to these foreign policies, and we'll have enormous economic problems, particularly if the Chinese retaliate to US sanctions, and there's a significant drop in trade. But that kind of drop in trade doesn't necessarily bode for Taiwan. What I always worry about is an erosion of relations with China. The Chinese will take it out on Taiwan. It's an easier step. And we know they continue to ratchet up pressure against Taiwan. The other thing is, though, I don't really worry. There are a lot of people who keep on saying the US economy is interdependent with China, and therefore the US can't really do anything. Even guys like John Mearsheimer, the offensive realism theorists, say that. But then it goes to argue that strategic interests always outweigh economic interests. And in fact, we have huge strategic concerns, growing strategic concerns about China. And if you look at the objective data, the United States, of all the major countries in the world, only 12% of its exports of goods and services, the lowest in the world, depends on those exports. Only 12% of its GDP. So, and of that, the majority are exports to Mexico, to Canada, followed by the EU and China. So it's a very small percent. One estimate in 2015 was U.S. trade dependence for major companies in the United States was about 1%. So people need to take a hard look at some of these figures and not just say the easy phrase, oh, they're too intertwined, can't separate them. I think my own view is that if there were a trade war, China has a lot more to lose than the United States does. In fact, a lot of American workers would welcome it. So my final point is that as a result of this situation, the U.S. should have no choice but to increase its support for Taiwan through arms trade and diplomacy. The more unstable East Asia is, the more the United States should value Taiwan's critical geostrategic importance with China. And to remember that the United States' relationship with China is not only based on common interests, but also on common values, as it is also with our fellow democracies, Japan and Korea. We need to reinforce the long-held U.S. view about the continuing importance of maintaining the viability of Taiwan as a democracy, if that is what the will of the Taiwanese people is. Therefore, it's especially good news to hear about the arms sale agreement, although that's probably enough. Moreover, there was very discouraging news on the trade front in late June when the American Chamber of Commerce visited Taiwan, because they said that while in the Congress it was marked by recognition of democratic values and support for human rights, and there was a positive attitude, but Trump administration officials tended to be very negative on Taiwan's trade. You know, the very fact that Trump is also now talking about withdrawing from the U.S.-Korea trade agreement, a very foolish tweet and attitude, despite the North Korean hydrogen bomb. You know, that's another discouraging trade signal. But for all these reasons, it's also increasingly important that democratic countries like Australia, India, Japan, and Korea also find the political will to give greater support to Taiwan, which is increasingly isolated and pressured by China. Now that the Trump administration has reaffirmed the importance of alliances with Japan and South Korea, both allies also need to consider further the strategic implications for them of a Taiwan that is no longer sovereign over its own territory. While it appears that Prime Minister Abe's government has already moved somewhat in this direction, it is less clear that Seoul is giving sufficient attention to Taiwan's regional importance, but that's from my limited perspective based on media reports. Meanwhile, and this is my last point, it's essential that Taiwan continue its own efforts to strengthen its defense forces, build its own economy, diversify its trade, and implemented much-needed social and educational reforms. It certainly needs to reform its bilateral relationship, improve it with the United States. The American Chamber of Commerce this year, in its white paper, mentioned 80 bilateral issues from last year, none of which had been resolved, and only 8 of which, 10%, had there been any progress on, or significant progress anyway. Even more critically is the need for Taiwan to do more to strengthen its security. As an authoritative senior U.S. official told a senior delegation, I think it was former Foreign Minister Chen Fu and former National Security Advisor Suu Kyi and other members of the delegation in Washington in early June, that this official told them Taiwan's security in the past had, quote, depended on China's self-restraint and possible U.S. involvement. He said the U.S. continued to support Taiwan's security, but there were no guarantees. It was unclear what the situation might be in the next 4 or 8 years. especially absent more Taiwan's efforts to strengthen its own security. The senior official observed that Taiwan's decision to move to an all-volunteer personnel system for its armed forces was simply wrong. It had reduced Taiwan's military strength and capacity to mobilize. Taiwan really needs to get over to its aversion to its military and careers of your own sons and daughters in the Taiwan military. It was also worrisome because unlike Israel or Switzerland, I would say, this is my comment, Taiwan lacks a strong and combat-ready reserve defense force. Moreover, contrary to the repeated claims of former President Ma, in the face of repeated U.S. advice to the contrary, an all-volunteer force is more expensive, not less expensive. Finally, Taiwan's security policy needs to demonstrate to Washington its determination to defend of Taiwan if it expects the support of the U.S. public opinion in the event of an armed conflict. It is therefore critical, in my view, that Taiwan continue to increase its defense budget, review and revise personnel requirements, and continue to adopt more severe laws, regulations, and measures to counter PRC espionage and cyber attacks. 4 years ago, in the fall of 2013, only a few months, only a year actually, after I retired from the U.S. Foreign Service and stepped down from the as director of AIT, I addressed this forum on the subject of Taiwan's future and national security and Taiwan's future. I spoke then and again now about how strongly I felt about the need to be a strong friend of Taiwan and how much I cared about Taiwan's future. At the same time, I said, quote, I also worry a great deal about Taiwan. I worry because I sometimes think the Taiwanese people do not worry enough. That concern of mine remains to this day. Then as now, I also firmly believe that sufficient self-defense forms the foundation for which Taiwan can most confidently manage relations with Beijing and thereby also contribute to both cross-strait and regional stability. It is also the foundation for continuing progress and prosperity of Taiwan as a democratic country. As in the past, so too in the future, Taiwan's fate remains foremost in the hands of the Taiwanese people. Thank you.
Thank you.
Stick to the time limitation. So you talk about 5 minutes under your allotment. So we can have a question or two? No question?
No. No, sorry.
所以反正咱确定要吃饭的时候，
因为我回答所有的问题，所以不需要。大家同意我的看法。
People can ask you questions in private.
当然。
Yeah. Okay. So, 所以咱甲这个大赛吼参详就对了，因为今晚无时间。
对。
多谢。Thank you again. Let's give him a hand.
With that, we conclude our morning section, and we will have a lunch break. Please come back on 1:30 p.m. 咱即马来食中昼，差不多1点半的时阵，搁倒来继续咱下晡的section。多谢。